Yeah.
Good afternoon. My name is John Herbst. I run the Eurasia Center program here at the Atlantic Council. Some people think that the big story today in Washington is the indictment of certain people associated with President Trump during the campaign. No, the really big news is that after 3 years, the Atlantic Council finally has set forward a lecture series on what's going on in Russia. So thank you very much for being here for the start of this. We have a 4-part series which starts with Russian demography, and we have Dr. Gaiane Safarova from St. Petersburg here to talk about this, as well as others. Our next session will be with Evgenia Albats on December 12 on Russian politics, and then early next year we'll follow this with a session on the Russian economy and on Russian energy sector. So again, welcome today. I will step down right now. I'll turn this over to my former colleague, Dr. Alina Polyakova, who now works at the Brookings Institute. She will be the moderator of the session, and you have the speaker's bio sheet, so you don't need to hear that from me. So again, welcome.
Okay, well, thank you, Ambassador Herbst, for inviting me back to the Atlantic Council. I'm really delighted to see this series begin here to really take a deep, more nuanced look at what's happening in Russia today and talk about some of the issues we don't usually talk about in Washington as well. So I'm Alina Polyakova. I'm a David Rubenstein Fellow at the Brookings Institution, the Foreign Policy Program. And it's really my pleasure to moderate the session today. Just really brief words of introduction of our distinguished panel. To my direct left is Mr. Ilan Berman, who's the Senior Vice President of the American Foreign Policy Council, and is also Associate Faculty at Missouri State University Department of Defense and Strategic Studies. Also an expert on many things, including Russian, also a fluent Russian speaker, as I learned today. And then to his immediate left is Professor Gaiane Safarova, who's the leading research scientist and the head of the Laboratory of Analysis and Modeling for Socio-Demographic Processes at the Russian Academy of Sciences in St. Petersburg, Institute for Economics and Mathematics. Really delighted to have her with us here today. I believe your first trip to Washington, if I'm not mistaken. Your first trip to Washington, if I'm not mistaken. Yes, so thank you for joining us. Dr. Safarova is also the author of a forthcoming Atlantic Council paper on Russia's demographic challenges in the near future. And then last but certainly not least, I have Dr. Judyth Twigg, who's the professor of political science at Virginia Commonwealth University, and is an expert at the intersection of demographics, demographic analysis, and public health issues, particularly in the post-Soviet space. So thank you so much for joining us. I thought we could start the conversation by having you, Gaiane, talk for about 5 or 7 minutes about some demographic trends that you describe in this forthcoming paper. I think here in the United States, people often talk of Russia as a declining power. And one reason that's often cited for this label is that Russians are basically dying, and over time, there won't be that many Russians left for the United States to worry about. I mean, this is I think the basic narrative. I think your paper, which I saw an early draft of, complicates that picture a bit. So why don't you tell us just, very briefly, some of the more interesting parts of Russia's demographic challenges?
Okay, thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for the kind invitation to take part in this discussion about Russian demographic situation. And I hope for your understanding. I am talking after 15 hours flight and 7 hours time difference. And moreover, I've never been to the United States and I am not native speaker. Then you just pronounced the words declining power. And a Finnish journalist who talked with me in summer, he was going to start his paper on demographic situation in Russia with the words of Mark Twain. It's just in case these words happen are with me. Mark Twain said, when news told that he died, that the reports of my death are greatly exaggerated. The same about as Russia's decline. I was asked to prepare material, and I hope that it will be result in a paper, because this is a draft of it. And Russian demographic situation is not only trends of in total population size. To understand changes in total population size, we should look at dynamics of main demographic processes. They are fertility, mortality, and migration. They determine changes in population size. Then, and this is of great importance, we should come to population age structure. To understand demographic situation of a country is not enough to look at its size. Population age structure is a highly important factor of demographic development. So consideration will be done of at first major age groups. They are children, working age population, and so-called elderly. The elderly is maybe not good work. And what happens with population age structure? Not only in Russia, but in all developed countries. Population age structure is growing older. The number and the proportion of the old people are increasing, resulting in a lot of consequences for almost spheres of life. Well, and then it is necessary to focus on specific features of Russian demographic development. Russia has the greatest territory in the world, and Russia's population is not so big compared with its territory, and the population density is very low. This challenges Russia's demographic future. Then Russian population is highly heterogeneous in different aspects. The main ones. They are rural-urban differences. There are about 25% of population living in rural areas with and living conditions are quite different in rural and urban areas, etc., etc., etc. Then, and there's enormously important aspect, gender gap. Russia is characterized by the greatest male-female difference in life expectancy, and there are enormous irregularities in the sizes of male and female in age groups, and there is enormous regional differences. The regions, there are about 80 regions united in several bigger units, federal districts, and these regions have a very different demographic characteristics, result in differences in structure, results in different rate of increase or decrease. Well, and well, what discussion may be without future trends of population. So this my paper is adventurous attempt to embrace the mentioned topics. To do this in full size, the great volume is required, but I was asked to be restricted by 4,000 words.
Well, I think when the paper comes out, I think it'll be obvious that there's a lot of very good information in there. I think one of the interesting trends that you point to, and Judy, I'd like to get your thoughts on this, is one, that the gap between male and female life expectancy is at 11 years in Russia today, which is huge. It's 64 for men, I believe, and 74 for women. And then on the other hand, I thought the interesting part was, Russia has actually recovered some of its fertility rate. So there is an upward trend in how many children women are having. And I think the latest number you cited was 1.86 children per woman, which is higher than many Western European countries, Italy, for example, Greece, maybe a few others. I'm interested in one, how are we seeing this upward trend? You talk a little bit about it in the paper. And then the other question, and Judy, maybe you could chime in here, and then we'll go back to Gaiane, is this life expectancy difference? What is going on with Russian men dying so young? And is this something that's just happening in Russia, or is it part of a broader pattern in the post-Soviet space?
So women live longer than men everywhere in the world. So the fact that there is a gender gap in life expectancy isn't a surprise. But the gap between male and female life expectancy is larger in Russia than it is anywhere in the world except Ukraine, where it's slightly larger. There was a fascinating study published just about a month ago that looked at Russian mortality and life expectancy going back to 1965 up through 2013, and found that about 52% of that male-female gap in mortality can be explained by differentials in alcohol consumption. And so it's very important, I think, to bring in behavior-related factors into the conversation about Russian mortality. In terms of fertility, between 2006 and 2012, 2013, the total fertility rate, the average number of babies that a woman has over her lifetime, that total fertility rate was the highest growing fertility rate in Russia in all of Europe, and the second highest growth in fertility in the world. So this is an extraordinary increase in childbearing, due most logically to the improvement in the economy, right? The socioeconomic indicators tick up, all of that natural resource wealth comes into the country. Some deferred childbearing, I think, from women who didn't want to have their first or especially their second child back in the 90s and the early parts of 2000s, and so we saw a lot of older women having mostly their second children during this time period. So this looks great. It's slowed down over the last couple of years. And it's also important, but I think its relevance has to be framed in the context of the fact that the total fertility rate is fertility per woman. And yet, because of the demographic echo from the early and mid-1990s, when there were so many fewer babies born at all in the immediate post-Soviet collapse, that demographic echo now, 20 to 25 years later, means that we're cutting literally in half the number of 18 to 20-year-old men and women there are in the country right now compared to, say, 2000, 2002. And so total fertility would have to go up to 3, 4, 5 children per woman, which isn't going to happen in order for the increase in overall births to continue, just because the cohort of women of childbearing age is inevitably going to get so much smaller over the next couple of decades.
That's really interesting, and Gaiane, you talk about this in your paper as well, because we may look at this increase in fertility that's been in the number of children born per woman in Russia as success of perhaps Russian policies that have tried to encourage women in various ways to have more children to try to solve the demographic problem. But I think so I would like to kind of get a sense from all of you how much policy actually has to do with it. But I think the other interesting point is that this is really just, in the grand scheme of things, not really going to help the Russian population rebound because of that small group of women of childbearing age. Gaiane, do you agree with this, that despite the growth in fertility over the last 10 years or so in Russia that's been extraordinary, that the number that Judy cited, that would have to be 3 to 5 children that a Russian woman would have to actually make up for the small cohort from the 1990s? Is that an accurate assessment?
Oh, certainly 4, 5. It is unreal figures. It will be realized in no case for 5 children. But the matter is, the situation with fertility in Russia, to my mind, is not extraordinary, because it is like in the majority of developed European countries. And it is even higher than for average European level. And as I repeat that 4, 5, it's absolute fantasy for our pronatalists. And it should be understood, and demographers understand that the number of births it may change. It changes due to demographic waves, and it will increase in the 30s due to a large cohort of potential mothers. But the very important source of population increase is migration, is positive net migration. For last 3 years, natural increase was positive, but it was very, very small natural increase, and total increase took place due to positive net migration. And do we want or not? But we should take this into account. That
so is Russia experiencing a brain drain?
Brain drain. Brain drain. It's a very interesting question. At present, well, I'm not an expert in this very topic, but not I think, but I see and I hear that in this special field, brain drain, not migration at all, in general, some people, highly educated, with very good, with having good positions, they come back to Russia because due to sanctions, situation is not favorable for Russians to find a job, good job in the West, and educated, skilled people, they don't want to clean streets, and it is known that even if employer want to take you, but he or she will not be able to do because it is necessary to only if will be no candidate from European Union.
So I think what you're pointing to, both of you, is that despite some positive trends, particularly in fertility, most of the trends are actually quite negative when it comes to Russian demography rebounding, right? And that all the projections point to the Russian population, because of migration, because of the lack of childbearing women, decreasing significantly over the next 10 to 20 years, right? Judy, is that your assessment? I'm going to get to you shortly. I just want to get the numbers right. Is that your assessment, basically, Judy?
Well, on the fertility and birth side, yes. There's also been a tremendous increase in life expectancy in Russia. They're now above pre-Soviet collapse numbers with life expectancy. Mortality is down. Obviously, there are still serious issues on underlying mortality, but a combination of factors, again, lifestyle choices, personal behaviors, some really good public policy over the last decade or so that has produced reductions in consumption of alcohol and tobacco. And again, just the over socioeconomic situation have produced reductions in mortality and increases in life expectancy that I think it's reasonable to expect those to be sustained over time.
And so you think this actually has to do a lot with state policy specifically? Ilan, I want to bring you into the conversation. What are your thoughts? I mean, I think this is the big question. I mean, how much of this kind of historic trends propelling Russia forward, and how much of it, some of these perhaps more positive trends we're starting to see in the fertility specifically, it has to do with Russian policy, domestic policy? Right.
Well, I think it's interesting to understand the difference between perception and reality. Right before the Soviet collapse, the Russian Academy of Sciences put out a demographic projection that envisioned that at that time, what we knew as the ailing Soviet Union would be over 225 million souls by 2025, I think. That sort of hasn't panned out that way, right? The trend lines are nowhere near that favorable.
What is the current population of 143 million? Is that correct? Current population of Russia?
146, right, because the annexation of Crimea helped.
Right, we can talk about that.
No, so this actually it speaks to sort of a fairly large disconnect between perceptions about the robustness of Russia's demographic profile and what's actually happening. So I think it's absolutely true to talk about good policy on the part of the Russian government, as long as we understand that this is tactical. Russia's sort of a whole series of policies, most famously the maternal capital campaign, has helped whittle around the edges of this problem. But structurally speaking, the Russian government hasn't made large-scale investments in the health of the population. Russian healthcare as a percentage of GDP has stayed exactly the same as it was 25 years ago. And so as you look at the overall health of the population, you have to understand that this demographic profile is profoundly affected by things that feed into it, things that help expand life expectancy, things like good hospitals and good infrastructure, things that cumulatively provide the lifeblood of a healthy nation. I've seen far less of that on an official governmental level than I would have liked in order to maintain the robustness of the Russian population.
So I think we mentioned a few things. One is the policy component, that the Russian government has done some good things. I think many European countries have also been struggling with how do you find the right policy to ensure that the population doesn't continue to decline, to encourage women to have more children. Some have worked, some have not. I'm skeptical as to what extent in a short period of time we can actually point to policy differences versus changes in economic well-being, for example. Because I'm not sure paying women some amount to have children when you don't have the infrastructure to actually support more children and bigger families is really that effective in the long term, perhaps, right? But I think the other theme I want to come back to, and I want to get you to weigh in on too, Ilan, is this brain drain question, right? We don't have great numbers on that, I don't think. There's some questionable statistics from Rostad that we can point to about outmigration, but people question the legitimacy of those and how accurate they are for various reasons. But the migration question, I think, is really significant. So it seems like the primary problem is that Russians are leaving Russia, right? And what is your sense of that kind of pressure and the potential kind of medium or long-term consequences that will have on Russian economy, Russia's ability to develop in a productive way, to diversify, et cetera?
So there's a lot to unpack here, and with regard to the brain drain question, Judy's really the expert. I would only sort of point to the fact that you're looking at a situation where educated Russians, better off, more ambitious Russians are facing a political environment that is deeply hostile to innovation, that's deeply hostile to intellectual property and personal property, and that obviously has an effect on whether or not Russians decide that it's a good idea to stay or it's a better idea to go and sort of vote with their feet. With regard to migration, though, I think we have to point to the fact that what we're actually talking about is we're talking about two things. We're talking about outmigration, and we're talking about labor migration into the Russian Federation. And
primarily from Central Asia.
Primarily from Central Asia. And this is actually is having a profound effect on the composition of the Russian Federation as a whole. If you salami slice the overall demographic statistics, you very quickly realize that the most robust cohort in the Russian Federation in terms of fertility are Russia's Muslims. Not Russia's Slavs, but Russia's Muslims. And there are essentially two groups within Russia's Muslim subpopulation that you're talking about. You're talking about migrant populations that have sort of migrated from Central Asia largely into the Russian Federation. And you're talking about indigenous Russian Muslims that essentially they live all over, but they live primarily in two pockets, in the Volga region and in the North Caucasus. They have different demographic profiles. They have different sort of circumstances, different levels of mobility. But what you find across both strata is that both populations tend to divorce less, they tend to drink less, they tend to behave in ways that shore up their demographic profile rather than detract from it.
And so Judy, I want you to get away in this since Ilan already mentioned the issue, the real expert on the brain drain question, but just to follow up, do we know how much Russia's growth in fertility is actually due to births specific to these minority groups that you pointed out? Judy, do you have a sense of that?
Well, we don't know religion because nobody reports data by religion, but we do have census data, and we infer ethnicity from regional location. So we can take the data that way. And it's interesting, Ilan's absolutely right, that the total fertility rates are much higher among the ethnicities that we traditionally identify as Muslim than they are among the Slavic ethnicities. That having been said, though, this big boom in total fertility rate that we've seen over the last 10 years, the slope of that curve has been higher among Slavic populations than it has been among Muslim populations. And so the gap is still substantial, but a little bit over the last 10 years, it's begun to narrow. Whether that's meaningful is another question. On the brain drain, most outmigration from Russia is still to Central Asia and to neighboring republics, but there's, I like the salami slice metaphor. If you take the salami slice of the creative class, the artists, the economists, the academics, the entrepreneurs, that's the brain drain, right? And that might be 20, 30, 40,000 people. The numbers might not be that big, but what they represent is potentially enormous because that's the entrepreneurial energy that in theory would be the basis for your diversification beyond a natural resource extraction based economy. And it's hard to get the exact numbers because a lot of times they're not turning in their passports and saying, we're out of here. They're just leaving. And so you have to look at some of the recipient statistics in the host countries. And you have to be clever. You have to look at things like school enrollment in private schools in UK, Germany, talk to the realtors in some of those some of those locations. And what you find is, quite a bit of entrepreneurial activity among realtors in London, where people are coming in and investing in new businesses to the tune of, $200,000 or $300,000, $1 million to open up a storefront somewhere in UK. That's entrepreneurial energy that's not being spent in Russia right now because those people are leaving for all the reasons that you outlined.
And have some water. But is there a general sense, as Gaiane was saying, that I know it's difficult to get numbers because people may leave Russia, but their status doesn't change. They're just out of Russia. They're not counted as immigrants or migrants, right? So they're not part of that statistic. But is it also your sense that more and more are returning because of a more hostile situation they may face abroad, as Gaiane was saying? Is that your sense as well?
There's anecdotal evidence that that's happening over the last year or two, but it's hard to see that showing up in any hard data that we can get a look at.
So, Ilan, if I can turn it back to you then, I think the point that Judy makes is a really significant one, that 20 to 40,000, you said, could be accounted for as this kind of entrepreneurial, better educated, more creative class, the brain drain effect. If perhaps a portion of them are coming back, but I would guess that many of them are not. What kind of consequences does that have for Russia looking forward?
Well, I think you can sort of very easily point to practical near-term consequences in terms of the vibrancy of Russian business, the vibrancy of Russian culture, right? Russia has an enormously deep and historic culture of literature, of history, of music, of art. None of that's going to change. But if you are, for example, a Russian computer scientist or a Russian engineer or innovator, and you're looking at places where you can incubate your ideas and bring them to fruition as a small, medium-sized business, a new technology, or whatever it is, you have to be weighing the consideration of whether or not this is a hospitable environment in order to do so. And that's where I think you're seeing a lot of that attrition. Not so much in the sort of although, sort of, as I said, Judy knows better, but I think you are seeing it among artists and among musicians and whatever it is. But I think the most notable, if I were to point to one subsegment, the most notable is sort of this engineer, sort of innovative class, technical class, that is looking for at least a more hospitable environment in which to innovate.
So this word hospitable environment has come up a few times. Gaiane, you're the only person on this panel who lives in Russia. So I just want to get your sense. I know that you're a demographer, and you can share all of these very interesting and more nuanced statistics on Russia's trends in the population. But you also mentioned that your sense, and anecdotally, as Judy mentioned, that's true, that some people are coming back because they're facing a more hostile environment abroad. But I guess my question is, what do you think needs to happen in Russia today so that not as many of those people leave in the first place, so that it is a better hospitable versus hostile environment within Russia, so those people stay?
So you mean not demographic trends, but you mean
what should change in Russia, yes, so those people stay?
Environmental, you mean in its pure sense, or in a moral, political, or other sense?
However you want to answer the question.
Okay. Well, at first I should say that I, as a researcher, as an expert in the field of a rather special part of the demography, and I have mentioned it in my draft, I play in the demographic field. So what I may say related to your question is it's a rather everyday life and taken from literature. Well, environment as an environment certainly is not excellent. Certainly, air is rather polluted, and And in some places, water is not of good quality, and so these things cannot but negatively affect the population health, etc. Environment in the sense of social atmosphere, certainly it can't be called ideal. There are, and well, it can't be otherwise. The extent is important. Unfortunately, in Russia, there is too many bureaucrats, and their number exceeds that of the whole Soviet Union.
Bureaucrats, government employees.
Bureaucrats, yes, in ministries and every city governments, and well, and let's imagine we have, for example, in the Soviet Union, we have, for example, Russia and the Russian Foreign Ministry. Now we have about 80 regions, and each, for example, region, almost each, has its, let's say, ministries. Ministry of Culture of Bashkortostan, or representative office of the representative of Chechen Republic in St. Petersburg, and so on and so forth. What I mean. And these people would like to show that they don't consume federal money for nothing.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why a number of projects of restructurization of everything are suggested, and they make the atmosphere, especially in many state institutions, very nervous. For example, very good example, it was decided, it's not a joke, it's reality, to unite Polytechnical Institute and Trade Institute. And the third one was Financial Institute. But it was done, and the institute which taught managers for trade and so on, it almost disappeared because students don't want to go to a polytechnical institute to get a financial education, because when they come to apply for a job related to finance, the employer certainly will ask, but why you have a diploma of Polytechnical Institute? This is just a small example, probably very sharp, but such things make atmosphere quite
irrational
nice,
decisions that don't improve the lives of people by various government agencies at the local and more federal level.
But they issued more and more projects. They changed the schemes, the format of reports, of plans, of so on and so forth. They decided to unite hospitals, and this makes an atmosphere not favorable for, I think that for healthy lifestyles. But this
I understand. I mean, I think there's been a lot of statistics in wondering about the fact that Russian the Russian state, whether it be federal or local state agencies, has become the largest employer in Russia. Because there are just so few jobs, there's so little economic diversification, partially because so many people who could be the driver behind that economic growth and revival are not in Russia, and they're not staying there. I want to take us out a little bit from Russia, but then I'll come back to Ilan, because I want to ask you a hard question at the end. But Judy, since you've been looking at kind of not just Russia, but other post-Soviet states, you brought up Ukraine earlier. Could you tell us a little bit more about, I think we're painting a pretty bleak picture of Russia. I think there's some positives here and there. The fertility rate seems to be the only one, and that's not sustainable in terms of actually increasing the Russian population over time, it sounds like. So it actually seems to me that the Russians are disappearing. I mean, for all of these various reasons. Maybe it's a bit more nuanced, a bit more complicated, but that is the basic outcome, right? And they're not unique in that way. So, what is happening in the post, I guess, Soviet space? You mentioned Ukraine and other places. Is this whole region experiencing these same things, or is this really something that is unique and can be attributed to Russia?
Well, it's been almost a cliche for the last 10 or 15 years to recite these gloom and doom statistics about Russia and say, it looks like the worst place in the world except for Ukraine. And if you run the numbers on Ukraine, things do look pretty bleak, but there's some interesting dynamism in Ukraine's health sector right now. A landmark piece of healthcare reform legislation was just passed 2 weeks ago in the Ukrainian parliament, hard fought by reformers, led by an acting Ukrainian health minister who's a doctor from Detroit, a Ukrainian-American radiologist who went back over a few years ago during the Maidan, and she has fought the corrupt vested interests who have been making money off of skimming millions of dollars off the top in vaccine procurement and charging people under the table for health care. And the health reform legislation that she's put in place, if they can get implementation going and continue to fight against these corrupt interests, has the potential to completely remake the Ukrainian healthcare system into something that has a shot at actually delivering decent healthcare to people at a reasonable cost. So it's one of the few sort of bright spots on the Ukrainian landscape these days is what's happening with the health system there.
Yeah, but in terms of some of these other trends we're talking about, the out-migration, the declining, the fertility problem, are some of the numbers that we see in Russia similar to what we're seeing in Ukraine or elsewhere in the post-Soviet space?
Yeah, very similar in Ukraine, and divergent dynamics around the rest of the post-Soviet space. So you could have a different conversation about each of the post-Soviet countries. One of the stories that is fun to tell is about Kyrgyzstan, which obviously has had its turmoil in the last few years. But Kyrgyzstan is this little jewel of a healthcare system in Central Asia that managed through a sort of effective management of a huge donor community back in the 1990s and early 2000s, spearheaded by a couple of really smart Ukrainian healthcare professionals that managed to bring decent primary care and pretty efficient hospital structures, and again, an extraordinary story of one small point of success in Central
Bright
Asia.
spots. Yes?
Related to Ukraine, though I did not plan to touch this subject. The matter is that I studied and I made comparison studies together with the leading Ukrainian demographer, comparative studies on Russian-Ukrainian demographic development. I stopped it immediately to 2005 for absolutely not political reasons. The matter is that my co-author became so outstanding that he had no time to make demographic studies, but no politics at all. And we have a number of papers and the project and so on. And until the mentioned year, demographic development of Russia and Ukraine had been similar. Some years total fertility rate in Russia was higher, and another in Ukraine. Life expectancies those time was slightly higher for Ukraine, etc. Very similar development took place. Moreover, we started our work when it was the Soviet Union. And after its collapse, I respect the Ukrainians and so on, but nevertheless they like too much speculate on Golodomor. Understand this? Translate. It's of the 30s. And they declare now that it was specially intended to kill, to slap the world
There was
Ukrainian
a genocide
population.
by Stalin, yes.
But and I show this figure for my students. We consider population pyramids for these 30s. For Russia and Ukraine, and I told which one is Russian, which one is Ukraine. It is not possible to distinguish.
Well, I don't think we should go on the historical.
Yes,
it's a very touchy and difficult subject, and also those statistics from the 1930s were suppressed by the Soviet regime, so I don't think those are necessarily accurate. So I don't want us to go back in time. I want us to go forward in time in our thinking. So with that in mind, Ilan, I have some hard questions for you, if you don't mind. So, going back to the big Russia question, though, right? Even though Russia is not an outlier when it comes to these demographic trends, I mean, there's a lot of conversations here in the policy space about, is Russia a real threat to the United States, to the West? And some people would say, like as we start our conversation, well, Russia's a declining power. Look, there's no Russians, the economy is relatively stagnant, and overall, there are profound consequences for Russian military. They don't have young boys to recruit into the army, for example. That will have profound consequences in the long term. So I guess my question to you is, one, some of these the bleak picture we're painting, what's your sense of how this will actually affect Russia's ability to pursue its own national security strategy at home and abroad? And two, do you think Russia is a declining power because of this bleak picture we're painting?
So I think really that's the central question. I can only the short answer is yes, and I think for my own from my own personal viewpoint, I think a declining Russia is inherently far more dangerous than a rising Russia, than a stable Russia, for a series of reasons. I would point out, I mean, there's lots of people in this town that make their bones on strategic forecasting, and I think Russia's a particularly interesting thing to look at when you look at demographic trends, because it presages these possible futures that we're already beginning to see, at least in part. One of them is the strengthening of a neo-imperial impulse on the part of the Russian leadership. There is a lot of territory that the Russian leadership wants. I would say it's fair to say that there's some territory that the Russian leadership wants more than others. And there's a very positive correlation between the areas that the Russian leadership covets and the composition of the population. I think if you travel around Central Asia and you talk to officials and leaders there, they say that they're worried in general terms about the possibility of a renewed Russian pressure, renewed Russian aggression, absorption. If you travel to Slavic places of the post-Soviet space, they don't talk in abstract terms. They talk in concrete terms about the danger that's inherent there. And I think there's a reason for that. It has a lot to do with demographics. The other component of this is what happens in Russia's Far East. Most people, this is not widely known, but the Russian-Chinese border was actually only settled in 2001. Before that, there was a series of interim arrangements that the Chinese felt and still feel were inherently unfair, and were foisted upon them as a result of the Second Opium War. And when you look at that agreement, and it has the very Chinese name of the 2001 Sino-Russian Treaty of Friendship and Good Neighborliness, that agreement does not exist in perpetuity. That agreement actually sunsets in 2021. And the reason this only has a 2-decade lifespan is because looking forward in time in 2001, officials in Beijing understood that the demographic composition between Russian territory and Chinese territory was actually very likely to favor them much more significantly than it favored them currently. And that's exactly sort of what's happening. So there is a contest, I think, coming sort of in Russia's east in terms of how you can actually hold population where there are less and less constituent Russians to represent the Russian state. And finally, the real question of sort of what we began to touch on Muslims. And look, all countries change demographically. America's changing demographically. That's not inherently a good thing or a bad thing. That's just a thing. But what you do see in a fairly significant fashion is that there is an expansion of Russia's Muslim minority. There's also a radicalization, at least in part, of Russia's Muslim minority based upon a whole series of things, including greater influence of groups like Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State within the Russian Federation. The reason these ideologies have been able to catch purchase in the Russian Federation, it has a lot to do with the fact that Russia's Muslims feel systematically shut out of institutions, systematically denied economic opportunity. And the end result of this is what we saw last week. So last week, the leading counterterrorism consultancy called the Sufan Group put out a report about foreign fighter returnees from the Islamic State. ISIS is declining in the Middle East. We're all worried about sort of where they go next. One of the hidden gems in that report was the fact that not Saudi Arabia, not Tunisia, but Russia was the single largest contributor to foreign fighters in the caliphate. The back of the envelope estimation is that there are 40,000 foreign fighters that have gone to Iraq and Syria to join ISIS.
From Russia proper?
No, 40,000 total. And from the post-Soviet space generally, about a quarter of that, 9,000, a little bit more than that. And Russia is far and away the largest single contributor to that 9,000. And that has a lot of implications for what Russia does in the sort of on the world stage, right? Russia's strategy in terms of counterterrorism right now is characterized as the best defense being a good offense. Russia has helped facilitate the outward flow of these radicals, and then it's gone abroad to fight them in places like Syria, so it doesn't have to worry about them coming home. But that's a tactic, that's not a strategy. And there's some hard questions that are coming in terms of the linkage between national security in Russia and demographics.
That's really interesting. I will be sure to look up that report too. So we have half an hour or so left. I want to give our audience an opportunity to ask a couple of questions. There'll be mics coming around. Please present yourself, say who you are, list your affiliation, and then please ask a question. Don't give us a lecture. So yes, please.
Alexei Sapchenko, no affiliation. Question about, you just mentioned about the Russian Far East. Back in 2000, there was a presentation made by a demographer exactly on the same topic who predicted that the situation in the Russian Far East economically was so bad that if by some chance Russian economy is going to start to grow and those people would be able to get some money, they would definitely migrate from the Russian Far East. In other words, that in case of improvement of the situation, there's going to be a depopulation of Russian Far East. The other very much linked issue to this, I've heard anecdotal stories about growing number of the Russo-Chinese marriages, in other words, Chinese men, because China runs out of men, and Russian women who are not happy about their Russian potential husbands who do not live very long because they drink too much and all this stuff. How real is this? Is there any numerical measurement for this trend? Thank you.
Thank you, Alexei. So 2 questions, one about the Far East and one about Russian-Chinese marriages. I think either of you, if you want to take it, but why don't you go ahead?
Well, for me, it's close. There's some male-female gap. Is the question.
Well, I think one question is about the population in the Far East. Может, по-русски?
Население Дальнего Востока быстрее, чем общее население России.
Естественно.
И растет ли количество русско-китайских браков на Дальнем Востоке с китайскими мужьями и русскими женщинами?
Yes. It's a question, or this is a statement? A question, but I think it is so. The matter is that this population flow internal in terms of internal migration, population from Far East leave this territory. It's true, and yes, it's one case, and really this Chinese and not migration. It's but it's really it's a big challenge for Russian demography, not only demography, because a lot of people from China come to Far East, and really this mixed couples and probably not always officially registered, but nevertheless this is fact, and I think that this Chinese migration and Chinese movement to Russia is probably it is not less important than the situation with the Muslim populations. Yes, it's so, and this should be taken into account.
Judy, did you want to weigh in on that? I think there was a question whether you had some specific numbers. I don't know if you do off the top of your head, but.
Well, just looking at the regional variation overall in health and demographic statistics in Russia, and in terms of mortality, life expectancy, birth rates, Moscow, St. Petersburg, and the natural resource producing regions do the best. The Far East and Siberia do the worst, and so it is a depopulating part of the country, and probably the most telling statistic here is that if you just line up Russia by regions along all of those standard demographic indicators, Tuva comes out at the bottom of the list, and you cannot distinguish it from Haiti. That's the country in the world where it's most similar.
Can I just 10 seconds, because I think that's actually absolutely right. Look, 15 years ago, if you read the Russian press, you would hear the Russians talk a lot, because they're not politically correct, talk a lot about the yellow peril. Right? Yeah. But that sort of hasn't proven itself out over time in terms of hard numbers. You would read in the press, 2 million Chinese who are in the Far East. There wasn't evidence of that. In fact, my institute did a study where one of our researchers sort of spent a lot of time in the Russian Far East, sort of looking at it, and the back of the envelope calculations were significantly more modest. They were looking at 250,000 people, whatever it is. But I would make the argument that the actual numbers are less significant than the overall political and economic trends that you're seeing. Because in a lot of these places, what you have is virtual Chinese suzerainty. In places like Vladivostok, they're much closer to Beijing than they are to Moscow. They orient themselves economically southward rather than westward. And as a result, the Chinese, the numbers don't belie the actual extent of Chinese influence. And I think that's what we're looking at. During the same time period that we're talking about, you are seeing this out-migration of Russians who used to be locked in place because of state policy in terms of where they lived, who are migrating to European Russia. So I think this sort of statistic from a couple of years ago was that in a quarter century, the overall population of the Russian Far East has declined by a quarter. And so now the population density in the Russian Far East is something on the order of 6 Russians per square kilometer. It's about the density of Wyoming, to give you a sense. And so the point is, for the Russians, this becomes a real strategic challenge. How do you hold that territory if you don't have any people?
So I saw quite a few questions. Mr. Ilarionov, and then we'll go to this side.
Yes, thank you. Andrei Larionov of Cato Institute. Could you please tell us a little bit about the reasons of the radical, I would say, catastrophic fall in birth rate in Russia over last year? It's just, as you know, after maybe 15 years since recovery, so birth rate started to rise, and death rate started to fall, or maybe stabilized a little bit. But approximately 1 year ago, last autumn, all these trends have changed dramatically, and now the fall in birth rate is comparable to the fall of birth rate in '92 during the sharpest economic, political, and social crisis in Russia. Now, yes, now it stays stagnation, but not sharp economic crisis. How this sharp fall in birth rates can be explained?
Well, I guess the first question is, do we have numbers? Has there been a profound
No, we have
drop?
numbers.
No, well, I just want our expert to confirm that, because she has the numbers in front of her. Yes.
Fallen fertility rate?
In 2016, I assume?
Birth rate.
Birth rate.
I think
And first half
fertility
of
rate, birth rate is the same. Okay. What year, or you mean year or period or what?
From October year 2016 to September year 2017, last year, 12 months.
To be frank, official figures for 2017, they are not published yet. Official figures.
Well, talking about monthly.
Not monthly. Well,
Recalculated at annual rate, which
well, but
50% decline in birth rate, which is
what? Sorry.
Well, I'm sorry, I'm let's
Sorry,
let her
what
answer, and then we can
what do you
let's not engage
mean?
in a debate.
The matter is that there are several measures of fertility, and we should understand what we are talking about. What do you mean by fertility rate?
I'm talking about birth rate.
Oh, birth rate. Birth rate. Crude birth rate. The number of births divided by the population.
Adjusted for number of population and adjusted for structure of population, assuming this is adjusted for share of female of birth.
So the total you are talking about total fertility rate.
Again, adjusted for number of women who can give birth to kids. So that is why it is adjusted. So you can talk about fertility rate. Okay, fertility rate fell by 12% within 1 year.
Total fertility rate, but total fertility rate last year's is not decreasing.
It fell by 12%. Crude birth rate fell 15%. Fertility rate fell by 12%.
What is your source?
It's a calculation. Everybody can calculate who knows demographics.
Crude birth rate, it is not a good measure, because crude birth rate depend on age structure. If we are talking about total fertility rate, this means the number of births per woman, average number of births per woman, which is expected to be born during her life. And this measure is not does not depend on population structure. It is considered as an objective measure of fertility, and this indicator is not decreasing.
Interesting. Judy, what is your sense in this debate? Has there been, I think this is important, has there been a real significant drop in either fertility or birth rate?
Both.
Both?
There's been a drop in both. And I think demographers would encourage us not to look at 1 year's worth of data and draw the conclusion that Russia is once again falling off some sort of demographic cliff. I mean, clearly the socioeconomic situation has changed over the last couple of years. This is a not unexpected response to that, but I think it's important not to reach immediate conclusions about these numbers, and instead to wait and see what the big picture looks like over the next 3, 4, 5 years, and whether we see actual trends.
So you would say, yes, I know, but so you would say wait till the 2017 numbers come out, and then we'll see how they fit into the broader pattern.
Mm-hmm. And also recognize that for quite some time now, we've seen these numbers in Russia be pretty immediately responsive to socioeconomic fluctuations, and so I wasn't surprised to see those 2017 numbers. Wouldn't be surprised to see them turn back around if things get better again.
Yeah, because clearly Russia has undergone a recession, especially since the collapse of oil prices, and this is likely leading to a decline in women having children. But I think that's a good point, and it's something we should keep looking at. Sir, please.
Thank you. I'm Harley Balzer from Georgetown University, and I'd like to get the group's response to two things. One, putting some numbers on something you have raised, and the other, talking about the elephant that hasn't been mentioned. By the end of 2015, President Putin confirmed that 350,000 entrepreneurs had sold their businesses and left Russia. I haven't seen a number since then. My guess is it's somewhere like 500,000. And that would be about a third of the small and medium entrepreneurs in the country. What kind of economic consequences could we expect from that? And second, there are 3 countries in the world where the rate of HIV infection has gone up in the last 3 years. They are Nigeria, South Africa, and Russia. Ukraine had the problem. They've solved it with one exception. Crimea is now having an increase in HIV because one of the first things the Russians did was to shut down the methadone clinics and the needle exchanges. So if we are seeing a major increase in transmission sexually, women to men, men to women, not only from drug users, what could we expect from increased mortality from HIV/AIDS?
So I think, yes, those are great questions. Judy, do you want to take the HIV question and public health more broadly? So I think this is really important, so please.
Sure. So infectious disease and HIV within that category of infectious disease is still a relatively small percentage of overall mortality. However, last year, Russia went over the 100,000 mark in average number of new cases of HIV infection. They're now above 1% prevalence of HIV in the adult population. And the problem is with policy. They're putting some money into treatment, so there are some people who are getting the antiretroviral medications that, as far as we know, can extend the life of somebody who's infected with HIV indefinitely. But with the policies that have been in place for the last 6 or 7 years in getting rid of international NGOs, getting rid of humanitarian assistance, getting rid of technical assistance that can help Russians with prevention of new cases of HIV, they have a real problem with turning off the tap of new infections. The epidemic is driven by injectable drug use in Russia, which is an enormous problem, and it's treated like a criminal justice issue rather than a public health issue. And this punitive stance means that needle exchange, methadone, all of the things that more enlightened countries do to get a handle on their drug epidemic aren't happening in Russia. So this is indeed a growing problem, something that might not be a substantial contributor to the overall mortality picture and the overall life expectancy picture, but it's a problem in terms of a drain on public resources and overall composition of the population. Should also mention just quickly that it also connects to tuberculosis because of the growing syndemic of injected drug use, HIV, and tuberculosis in the country. If Russia doesn't change the way it deals with tuberculosis, and we should give credit to them for having made huge strides in the last couple of decades in moving toward modern methods of diagnosis and treatment of tuberculosis, but Russia is ground zero, along with India, South Africa, and the Philippines, ground zero for multi-drug resistant and extra drug resistant tuberculosis. And this is a problem not just in Russia, not just in the post-Soviet space, but this is a problem for Central and Western Europe as well.
The so-called social diseases.
Yes.
Social diseases, yes.
And I think paired with the comments that were from you, Ilan, about the lack of investment in the healthcare system, right? That there's not really a system for treatment for those who are diagnosed positive with HIV, antiviral medications and things like that. So maybe over time, I would think from what you said, Judy, though I'm not a demographer, that given the lack of treatment, the high transmission rate, you will see higher rates of deaths related to HIV/AIDS than you would in other developed countries, you could say. And Ilan, did you, or just somebody else in the panel, want to answer the gentleman's first question about the small, medium-sized enterprises and the fact that many are being sold in Russia and those people, or those entrepreneurs, are leaving?
I put it in broader context. I think we already talked about brain drain a little bit, but just to step back a little bit and think about these population numbers. You know, it's 145-ish million right now, and whether we go to the projections of moderate population growth, I think you've described as the best case scenario up to 150 million 20 or 30 years out, or whether it goes down to 120, 130 million. I think the absolute numbers aren't as important as who those people are and what you want to do with those people. So if Russia remains a natural resource extraction-based economy, quite frankly, you don't need that many people, and you don't need that many particularly well-trained or educated people to sustain that as your primary source of revenue. But if they want to diversify beyond that, if they want to have good entrepreneurial energy, if they want people who are trained to do the kinds of things that move the economy in more productive directions, then you not only need healthy people, but you need the other dimension of human capital. You need appropriately trained and educated people as a part of this equation. And right now, because there are so few young adults in Russia compared to 20 or 30 years ago, there are university spaces for pretty much every 18 or 19-year-old in the country. They're graduating lots of humanities majors, lots of business and finance majors. What they're not training are the people who can do things like plumbing and machine tool operation and electricians, the kind of people who can work with their hands, build stuff, fix stuff when it breaks. There's a real dearth of that kind of education. The people who know how to do those things are aging, and they're not being replaced by new generations. So we've got not just that higher level entrepreneurial energy, but the basic sort of building block technicians aren't being trained. So there's not only a health problem that falls out of the demographic problem, but there's a skills and training issue as well.
That's a really interesting point, and you want to.
So yeah, just one point, because I actually I'm delighted to sort of hear the question because it sort of confirms my thesis. The only thing I would add here is that the projection of best case scenarios being modest growth in terms of the Russian population, that's great, but that's just one projection, right? There are negative projections that suggest that the Russian population could constrict, including projections that say that it's going to constrict very significantly by the bottom of the century. So I sort of, if you're a small and medium-sized businessman, you're like Willie Sutton. You rob banks because you go where the money is, right? So the point is, at a certain point, this becomes not just a capacity question, not just a question of whether or not they're trained, incentivized individuals, entrepreneurs. This also becomes a market size question. As the Russian market becomes less populous, it becomes smaller, and businesses go elsewhere.
Interesting.
You have to go where the bureaucrats take less of your money.
As it goes to the earlier point, Ariella, you had a question?
Yeah. Ariel Cohen, the Atlantic Council. Back to Harley's question on entrepreneurs, if it's true that, and I have no reasons to doubt it, the 1/3 of entrepreneurs shut businesses and emigrated, it is the entrepreneurial neutron bomb. This is devastating for any country. Can you imagine if 1/3 of American small businesses, and we have percentage-wise more small businesses than Russia, but nevertheless, any country that loses 1/3 of small businesses would be devastated. And think about what happened with entrepreneurs and factory owners and business people after the revolution of 1917. It destroyed the country's economy. But my question is different, and it's a complicated question, because I did audience research for a living for 8 years for Radio Liberty. When I talk to my friends in Moscow, St. Petersburg, etc., they say that in some schools, the Slavic Russian children are maybe in single numbers, at less than 10 in class. Not in all schools, it depends on every. What does the in-migration of people from Central Asia and North Caucasus is going to do to the urban composition of the sort of central Russian cities like Moscow, St. Petersburg, Yekaterinburg, etc.? Is that going to fundamentally change the sort of the type of Russian culture that we have now in terms of language, education, etc.? What is the reaction? What kind of political repercussions can come from that? Thanks.
Ilan, I think you started talking about this a little bit. I've read a statistic related to this question, and correct me if it's wrong, that Moscow is one of the highest recipients of migration, particularly from Central Asia. And that we don't really think of Moscow as this highly diverse city, but something like 1/3 of the inhabitants of the metropolitan area are actually immigrants from Central Asia. So Ilan, do you want to start with this question, and maybe Judy, you want to chime in?
Yeah, it's an interesting sort of looking at it from sort of what I work on, which is security and sort of politics and how the demographics impact this. I actually think it's fascinating. Moscow is second only to Istanbul in terms of the percentage of Muslims in an urbanized area. In a European.
Absolute numbers.
I'm sorry?
Percentage or absolute numbers?
I think percentage.
Proportional?
Proportional, right, proportional. That has implications, obviously, for social cohesion, as does the sort of the declining representation of Russian Slavs in sort of the national polity, in the Russian military, for example, in terms of unit cohesion, in terms of strategic cohesion. But I think where this plays out in the most interesting fashion, at least in the near term, is what Russia does now in terms of counterterrorism. So one of the interesting conversations that people aren't having, for example, is that as everybody's worried about the collapse of the Islamic State and sort of these returnees, every country is sort of trying to figure out their own proximate approach to insulating their populations from sort of this phenomenon of alumni and this radicalization phenomenon. Russia is disproportionately vulnerable to this type of radicalization because Russia is the world's second largest importer of migrant labor. So if you are in a Central Asian country and you envision, name a Central Asian country, you envision the possibility that the several hundred Islamic radicals that have left may now return and they may create instability within your borders, you have recourse. You can do things like stripping them of citizenship, you can sort of increase re-entry requirements, all sorts of things that governments can do and are doing. But for the Russians, they're a little bit more constrained in terms of what they can do because they're looking at an external workforce of very significant proportions that if they begin implementing those policies, they'll have a significant labor dislocation within the country. And so that's an interesting thing, sort of phenomenon to watch as we look at how Russia grapples with this phenomenon because it's intimately tied to what you're talking about.
Well,
what I'm more aiming at is what are the domestic, internal, cultural, and political repercussions.
I was only told to start. I wasn't told to finish. She's going to finish.
No, it's a very interesting and important topic. But unfortunately, there is no serious studies on these topics. There are we can talk about later. I should. But who will do my work? And the matter is that there is no serious, no serious, reliable studies, and everything which is beyond such is only everyday chatting. Well, observation really show that this is the case, really. And in St. Petersburg, it is probably the same. And this is the case of suburbs. Certainly, in the city centers, both in Moscow and St. Petersburg, such things are not observed. But in the because dwelling in the centers are much more expensive, and migrants can't live there, or they live 50 persons in one apartment. It's not joke. And in the suburbs, such cases when Slavic children are not the majority of a class, it may be real. Well, it's just talks and some observations. But this, what does it mean? It means that a serious, thorough investigation is required. It is necessary to understand and to think what should be done. What should be done not to get new enemies. How to adopt all these people, because it's a very serious problem. Because in their families, these children talk with their parents in their native languages. Well, and I even was told about the case that the majority in the class was of other nationalities, not Slavic people, and the question was that the teacher should give lessons in their language, not in Russian. So,
Different groups.
Well, so yes, because the audience does not understand Russian. So it's, but I repeat that this do not say, oh, the half of classes, the half of children are not Slavic and so on. We should get thorough knowledge. Otherwise, it's very dangerous.
Very anecdotal so far. Judy, did you want to chime in?
Just a couple of points. This isn't just a Moscow-St. Petersburg issue. If you look at the official migration data, there's emigration from Central Asia into small and medium-sized cities in the Urals and the Volga region, all over the country. Back to your point about entrepreneurial departure and loss of entrepreneurial energy, two things. One is that the Kremlin's happy to see them go. Right, this creative class, they're the people who are most likely to make a fuss and protest in the streets, and so they've made explicit statements about, waving goodbye, we won't miss you. Another point, though, to inject a note of optimism here, is that this brain drain of the creative class is a factor that is relatively easily reversible if things change in Russia. That these are people who haven't given up their passports, they haven't given up their residence permits, they're sending remittances back. Remittances back to Russia have skyrocketed in the last decade or so. And so these are all people who have a relatively straightforward path to return should they see an environment that's worth going back for.
Thank you, Judy. I will just mention one thing, wearing my old Atlantic Council hat. I should mention that Atlantic Council is doing a study of the new Russian migration in the United States and also eventually in Europe to try to get a sense from these people who belong to this brain drain creative class of what their plans are, how they see the future of Russia. Would they go back? They're given the opportunity. Do they face what kind of environments they face here? So Ambassador Herbst will be working on that study. It should be out, I think, within the year. But it is, you're right, because there's not much research on it beyond the anecdotal. So we have 2 minutes left. If it's a very brief question, I will take it.
It's very brief, I think.
Okay.
Thank you all very much. Every time I go to a demography briefing on Russia, I get more worried. One issue that nobody ever raises, and I'm not a Russia expert, I went there a lot when I was at the State Department, but I never was assigned there, is the question of the increasing role, as I understand it, under Putin, of the Russian Orthodox Church in a lot of the social issues. Whether it's HIV, whether it's birth control, whether it's various other things. Can you just comment on that? Because it's one that's often overlooked, and I think it might be more important than we give it weight to be.
Who wants to take that question?
Just briefly, the church is one of the chief architects behind the regressive policies on harm reduction for drug users, on HIV, and increasingly, for a while now, they've been bringing the abortion debate back onto center stage. So it's an issue.
What? Repeat the last one.
Abortion and reversals of legalized voluntary abortion. Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Anybody else want to comment on that? Ilan?
Fine. No, the only thing I would point out that sort of in the little sandbox where I play, the church has had I think a very significant but very negative impact on intercommunal relations within Russia in terms of creating an open, inclusive atmosphere that sort of the government loves to use the term off-ramps, right? But off-ramps radicalization among minorities, sort of Muslim, majority Muslim minorities in Russia, the creation of this ultra-nationalist identity, which is part and parcel of what the church has contributed to the Putin government, has systematically excluded these people. And so if you have to belong somewhere. So it has contributed to their formation of alternative identities, which are not healthy for us or for the Russian state.
I agree. Moreover, Russian, the behavior of Russian Orthodox Church evoke negative feelings from the substantial part of Russian so-called intelligentsia, because and though it's not the discussion on this topic, but as we touch upon, it is oriented oriented on lower classes, I could say widely, because but steps, because people see what cars they have, what, and many people don't like things they do in Petersburg. There is a great opposition towards their wish to have the St. Isaac's Cathedral and so on and so on. So it's really Russian Orthodox Church, I agree, does not work on uniting Russian population, not some Slavics and so, but Russian population.
Thank
I
you.
agree with you.
Thank you. That'll have to be our final word. An interesting topic. We have another discussion just on this question, I think. So please join me in thanking our panelists for this really fascinating conversation.
Thank you.